So as I was mentioning last time, of course, we're going to finish up with Chapter 10, Campaigns and Elections. We have a little bit more on the election side that we need to cover. We need to cover a little bit more on the conventions and the nominating process, even though we touched on that a bit in the previous chapters, but we'll do a quick review on that. And then we will get to the Electoral College, which we haven't covered yet. We've referenced it a bit, but we haven't covered it yet. And then we'll talk a little bit about campaigns and what campaigns are and how campaigns are run. I'll give you all, some insight since I have volunteered for several different campaigns across the federal, state, and local level. I'll give you all some insight in terms of kind of the inner workings of campaigns and how they work and things like that, and what are some of the successes when it comes to campaign strategies. So we'll discuss that a little bit, and then that should we should be able to finish with the chapter here. But yeah, we'll definitely talk about the Electoral College, and I'll show you all the Electoral College map for the 2020 presidential election here. So, okay, so let me go ahead and share the screen here so we can continue. Okay, let's see, share, and then let's go to the because we left off on the nomination process, right? Because I wanted for us to to talk about this first, and again, we kind of referenced this a little bit, but again, we'll go a little bit more into detail here. So when we look at the presidential election nominating process, we talked about how we've got we talked about this in the political parties chapter, right? We talked about the party conventions, right? We've got because after the vote within the primary, which I'll show you all that information, then we have different levels of conventions, right? We've got county conventions, and you can participate in those conventions because when you all go vote in the primary, the elections workers, they'll usually give you a flyer that the parties give to the election workers to pass out. And in that flyer, it gives information on the upcoming county conventions. It usually happens about a couple of weeks, maybe a month after the primary election ends, because then they have to figure out who the delegates are going to be, right? We're going to talk about the delegates right here in a bit, right? So, and then from there, you can move on to the state conventions and then to the national conventions, right? We talked about that a little bit before. So let's discuss this further, right? So the first stage in a presidential election is the nomination phase, right? So nomination involves primary elections and caucuses, right? So of course we talked about this in previous chapters, right? A caucus, of course, is a meeting of voters to choose the party's candidate. We talked about how that the states that have the caucuses, like the Iowa caucus, which is the very first primary election event that we have in all the states. Iowa goes first, as I mentioned, right? The Iowa caucus is first, followed by the New Hampshire primary, right? So this is why, and again, most people aren't really going to be too much aware of this because most people, as we've covered in this class, are not really keen on politics. They don't really pay attention to political news. They're not watching the news every day. People are not like me and my mom, right? Where we're watching like CNN and MSNBC like nonstop, right? It's kind of like our entertainment. We find the news entertaining. A lot of people really don't find the news entertaining, and for a lot of the reasons we talked about before, that if you're not used to watching the news, it's kind of hard to get started because they'll reference things from like the 1980s and the 1990s, and you're kind of like, well, what gives here? So you would have to have been keeping up for a long time in order to just kind of seamlessly flow in. So that's why it kind of turns off to some people, because a lot of it is kind of stuff that they would have to do extra research on, and people either don't have the time or they're watching TV to get away from work, right? They want to kind of relax and not really have to do much critical thinking. But again, so that we've talked about that before, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that the Iowa caucus, of course, goes first, right? We talked about how that this is why you'll see candidates go to Iowa. Like they'll have meetings in Iowa, they'll go to events, and the first thing you'll think of is, oh, are they going to run for president? Because why are they there in Iowa of all states? So that's usually a good indication. So if you've got, let's say, someone showing up to Iowa right now, we've got the primary season is going to start early next year. You would definitely want to find out a little bit more. Why are they in Iowa of all places, right? That could be a tip off to them possibly running for president, right? So again, so the Iowa caucus, of course, goes first. We talked before about how a caucus operates. You have these meetings out in these big auditoriums, usually like school gymnasiums, and it's all like it's public voting where people are trying to convince each other, to support a certain candidate. It's really cool. Like they've got videos on YouTube where it shows like, you've got like one section over here, this is for Joe Biden, another section over here for Bernie Sanders, another section over here for Elizabeth Warren, another section over here for Michael Bloomberg, and you've got all these people just congregating with each other. Of course, also remember that was pre-COVID. That was right before COVID hit. So if this was having, at the height of the pandemic, we probably wouldn't have had the Iowa caucus for that reason. But anyway, so the Iowa caucus goes first, followed by New Hampshire. And so this is why candidates will spend a lot of time, because in Iowa and New Hampshire, these are the two states that kick off the primary season. In Iowa and New Hampshire, candidates spend a lot of time on retail politics, meeting voters face to face. This is where they'll have meetings. They'll have campaign rallies. They'll have town hall events. Candidates will also go to like, community events. Like they'll go like to county fairs there in Iowa, right? They're wanting to go and go and meet people, right? And the reason why Iowa and New Hampshire are so important is because since they're the first states, you can't necessarily win a primary at the beginning, but you can certainly lose it if you don't get any support in these two states. So you need to have momentum, and you need to have momentum for the rest of the states, because if, let's say, a good example of this was in 2016, in the Democrat primary, it was between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. There was also former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley, and he didn't get any support. He got like, it was at 0%, right? He got just a handful of votes. So Martin O'Malley had to suspend his campaign. He basically had to drop out of the race because nobody was supporting him in Iowa. So if he didn't get any support in Iowa, chances are that he's not going to get support in New Hampshire and the other states, and no one's going to donate to his campaign because, hey, nobody picked you in Iowa. So why are we going to spend money on this candidate, right? So that's why Iowa and New Hampshire are so important, because you have to have a good showing. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to win it, but you have to have a good showing to where you can try to get more support and build support in the rest of the other states, right? And then results from each of the states' primary or caucus determines how its delegates or representatives will vote at their party's national convention. Now, we also talked about this last time, right? That the number of votes that candidates pick up also translates into number of delegates at the national convention. So let me show you all really quickly the Texas primary, and then we'll kind of come back here in a bit, because I want to show you all how this works in real time. So let me scroll over here. Let me show you the where is it? Okay, so these are the primary results from the 2020 primary election in Texas. So this was a couple of years ago. Okay, so let's take a look at the Democratic numbers here. All right, so when we look at you see that Joe Biden wins Texas, right? So he got 34.6% of the votes. Second place was Bernie Sanders, right? So he got almost 30% of the votes, right? So you can see the percentage, right? Joe Biden defeats Bernie Sanders by a little less than 100,000 votes. It also shows a map of the counties in terms of who voted where, right? So Joe Biden tended to do well in some of these metropolitan areas like Harris County, Houston, DFW, as well as most of the rural Democrat counties, whereas Bernie Sanders did well in some of these progressive areas, right? Like definitely Travis County, Austin, down the I-35 corridor. Over here, Brazos County, this is Texas A&M. So he did well in these college places, as well as along the border here, right? So even Bernie Sanders, he ends up winning Hidalgo County barely, but he ends up winning. So you can see how the numbers over here, we have the percentage, but we also have the number of delegates, right? So this is what it's talking about, right? That the percentage of these votes is also going to translate into a certain number of delegates, right? So Joe Biden picked up 114 delegates. Bernie Sanders picks up 99. Just kind of a cute note. I'm one of those 99. I was one of those 99 delegates for Bernie Sanders. So I'm very proud of that. But anyway, so you see how that's the percentage, right? Michael Bloomberg, he got 14% of the votes, so he got 10 delegates. Liz Warren got she got less percentage, so he gets less delegates. Pete Buttigieg didn't get any delegates, and so forth and so on, because it already dropped out of the race here. So, but yeah, so I wanted to show you all this map so y'all can see where the delegates come from and how they subscribe the delegates, or I'm sorry, they assign the delegates based on the percentage, right? So 34.6%, that's going to get you 114 delegates, because if you do the math, that'll divide up the number of delegates here. So just wanted to show that to you all really quickly before we move on here. And that's the way it works, right? So So then let's talk a little bit more about this, and then we'll kind of move on here. Okay. All right. So then, of course, like general elections, early primaries and caucuses have high levels of national media coverage, candidate campaign ads, and intensive voter mobilization drives, right? So you're going to see this early next year. You're going to see a bunch of campaign ads coming up, like on YouTube as well as on TV. And then after early March, they're gonna magically disappear, because they're going to only run until the primary season. So Texas has their primary early March of next year. So by the spring break, you're not going to see any political ads, at least not for a bit. But in that lead up in February, for sure, you're not going to be able to escape logging into YouTube without seeing campaign ads, because obviously, of course, they're trying to campaign for the for the March primary coming up, right? So of course, again, and not just local, not just campaigning here locally within these states, but of course national media coverage. That's what they're already talking about the primary season already on the news. Not necessarily as much, because of course, obviously, there's a lot of discussion about what's going on with former President Trump and all that and his legal troubles. But once we kind of move past that and we get like to the fall and moving, and certainly by winter time, we're going to be having a lot of discussion on these primary elections, especially on the Republican side, because it appears that Joe Biden is probably going to run for re-election. So we're probably not going to have too many major Democrat primary challengers, because in today's day and age, it didn't used to be like this. Back when the political parties had a lot more power, you would actually have situations, like I mentioned before, where sitting presidents would not be able to run for re-election because the parties didn't nominate them, right? But nowadays, the parties don't have that kind of power. Now it's the president. The president is basically the de facto leader of their political party, respective political party. So if a sitting president wants to run for re-election, the parties are not going to disagree with that. Like they're gonna allow for a sitting president to seek re-election. So on the Republican side is where we're going to see more of this. We'll see a lot more candidates on the Republican side. Trump has already said that he's going to run for re-election. We'll see about some of these other people, like current Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He's looked at as kind of like the second option. I know Nikki Haley also, she's also going to be running as well. So we'll see, some of these candidates pick up, because since the Republicans are the challenger party, we will probably see more of these candidates coming up, right? But again, lots of media attention, and of course going door to door, canvassing people, trying to get them to vote, trying to mobilize the voters, trying to get them to turn out for their candidates, right? Okay, so Iowa and New Hampshire's disproportionate role in picking presidential candidates is due to their being the first states to cast votes, right? So like we talked about before, right? Iowa and New Hampshire allows for that, that presidential momentum to to kick in if the candidates are able to do well in those two states. That carries them, some momentum into the next state, which is South Carolina, and then they move on to Super Tuesday, with Texas being one of those Super Tuesday states, and trying to maintain that momentum, right? The presidential nomination process today has become front-loaded. Front-loading refers to when states vie to increase their political influence by holding their primaries or caucuses earlier in the year. So yes, this does happen, where states are trying to jockey for position to try to get their primaries as soon as possible, because you don't want to be the last state that votes in the primary, because in a lot of cases, by then the nomination for president may already be sewn up. It may already be clinched, right? So New Mexico is one of the last primary states. Puerto Rico also holds primaries, which is interesting, right? Because they can't vote in the presidential election if they're on the island, but they can still have primary elections for candidates. So Puerto Rico tends to be last as well. So you don't necessarily want to, if you're a state that's last, that's kind of frustrating, because you could have a situation where what's the point if the presidential nomination is already locked up? So that's why a lot of these states try to jockey for position. And that's also why there's discussions about, hey, should we maybe rotate primaries, right? Maybe we should have different states be at the front of the line, so to speak. Maybe have it like on a rotation basis. Those are things that have been discussed. Early voting states are important because they help candidates secure national media attention, contributions, and higher ratings in public opinion polls. Again, going back to that momentum that I was talking about, right? That's why these candidates want to do well in these early states. again, not necessarily that they win these states, because Joe Biden didn't win. President Biden did not win Iowa or New Hampshire on the Democrat side in 2020. Iowa was a virtual tie between current Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg and current Senator Bernie Sanders. They were pretty much were in a tie for Iowa, and then Bernie Sanders won New Hampshire outright. So Bernie was doing very well, but then Joe Biden ended up overtaking him in South Carolina. And then that's when Joe Biden was able to pick up that momentum by winning South Carolina. So that was still an early state. That was the third state. So these early states are extremely important. In fact, you could probably make an argument that South Carolina is also an extremely important state in terms of its primary. But as you can see, those early states, it's important to be able to pick up that momentum by getting that support and being able to launch yourself further in the primary process. A candidate who fares poorly in these early voting states may be written off as a loser and drop out of the race, like we talked about here with Martin O'Malley. We also saw this. There's a good CNN video that I have in the additional resources where it shows you all the Iowa caucus, and it shows that, other Republican primary candidates like Mike Huckabee also dropped out and things like that. So again, if you don't do well in these first states, and if you don't get any support like O'Malley did, you're not going to be able to continue, because no one is going to support you. If you couldn't even get even just a little bit of support in these states, if you don't finish in the top 3, in Iowa, it's going to be very hard to be able to maintain that momentum here. So it's definitely something that's why the candidates definitely pay attention to these early states here. Okay, so let's talk about the party conventions a little bit. I know we've mentioned them before. But let's go a little bit more detailed. And so in the nation's first 50 years, presidential nominations were controlled by congressional caucuses, right? So again, the primary process has really evolved to where originally it was basically the parties who were choosing candidates. Again, these caucus meetings were controlled by party elites, right? By the congressional caucuses. That's why it's called King Caucus, right? So it was basically the top ranking officials within the respective political parties that would decide who the next presidential nominee from their respective parties would be. So the people didn't really have any input in terms of who those candidates would be. Eventually, party conventions ultimately replaced King Caucus. So we started to see, so instead of the congressional committees choosing, now we started to move to these actual nominating conventions. So state party leaders picked the delegates from the 1830s to World War II. So still at this point, the people still don't really have any influence on the nomination process, right? They moved away from just having the congressional caucuses pick it to now the state party leaders, right? And more leaders within at the state level as well now started to assign these delegates, right? So it's still being controlled by the party, so to speak, right? And one of the most famous party conventions was the one in Chicago. Was the Republican convention in 1860, which saw Abraham Lincoln ultimately win the nomination, but they had to go to several ballots. It was between him and Seward, the former governor of New York, and they were competing with each other to ultimately get the nomination. And Lincoln was looked at as a dark horse candidate, like Seward was looked at as more of the establishment candidate, but Lincoln was able to secure the votes on all those, on several ballots afterwards for the nomination. So Lincoln was able to ultimately secure the nomination to become president. But so again, so that's the way the party conventions were. But then ultimately, now we have the primary and caucus system, to where now the people are now ultimately selecting who the candidates will be by basically voting in these primary elections. It's like a pre-election before the general election, right? So now the people pretty much have the power when it comes to who's going to be the nominees. Right now, of course, the parties still have their own specific rules. Like I mentioned before, the closed primaries, you have to pre-register with the party, and so different it's the same political parties, but the states are going to have different rules on all that. And there usually is, some disagreement on those issues and things like that. So delegates draft the party platform, a statement of party philosophy, principles, and policy positions. So we did talk about this in the political parties chapter, right? That this is basically a document that explains what the party stands for when it comes to all of these different political issues and how they're going to go about trying to solve these specific issues when it comes to like healthcare, education, immigration, gun reform, reproductive rights, all of that, all of those major issues, the economy as well, right? All those major issues are going to be listed on the party platform. And you can also find the party platform as well online. It's usually about like about 100 pages long, and it goes more into detail on that. So, but anyway, so yeah, so that's the party platform. Okay, so let's talk about the Electoral College really quickly. Okay, all right. So this is definitely let's get into this really quickly. So I'm sure some of y'all have heard of the Electoral College, and I'm sure you all are somewhat familiar with it. So let's kind of break this down here, right? So even though the voters do directly vote for the presidential nominees in the primary process, they do not technically vote directly for the president. Instead, voters select electors who represent their state in the Electoral College. So let's talk about what the Electoral College is, right? So electors in the Electoral College select the president and the vice president. The state party typically chooses the electors, and the number of electors for each state equals the size of its congressional delegation, House members plus senators. So let's kind of break this down a bit, right? So again, this is an indirect electoral process where when you're voting for president, you're not necessarily voting for the name on the ballot, right? Even though the name on the ballot is there, you're technically not voting for the president. You're voting for the electors who are then going to meet at the Electoral College convocation. They go meet like at the state capitol, and they formally cast their votes for the president. So it's an indirect process. And of course, this goes back to, we were talking about in chapter 2, right? Remember we talked about how the Federalists were not really all that trusting of the common person because very few people were educated. They also, it was a new country. There was a lot that could have gone wrong. There was, the rule of law and the systems of law were very new. So some of the framers, especially the Federalist framers, were very concerned that the average person might not necessarily be as well versed in government because government is complicated. So they might not necessarily make the so-called right decision or the most logical decision. So instead, we had an indirect system where the electors, who would be these respectful people in the community, they would ultimately make the decision for who would be president. Now, we do have to mention that as there's been more attention, as there's been more direct democracy when it comes to the primary process, we do see that the electors are not necessarily, what I'm trying to say here is that the electors are usually going to go with the votes of the people, right? They don't have to, but they usually do that. Now there have been a few cases where they have not. You've seen like some of these rogue electors where they'll cast, a vote for a different candidate, even though, the candidate that got the most votes should have gotten the electoral college votes. But again, it goes back to the fact that the electors do not have to vote in terms of what the votes do, but they normally do. And some states are trying to push legislation to where the electors have to vote. They're trying to make some reforms to the Electoral College because the Electoral College is a little bit controversial because of the fact that the electors do not have to vote along what the people in the state did. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So let me talk about the state party, how they choose the electors, because again, I've been in this process myself, because at the state Democratic convention that I attended virtually in 2020, one of the positions that you could run for at the convention was to run for the electors. So I did run for that. I didn't get it. I wasn't selected to be an elector, but I did run for it. So I did put my name in the hat. And I thought it was an interesting process, and I did learn a lot about what you're supposed to do to try to get these positions at the state convention. So I had never done this before, and I learned that you can go and like call people, you can go and send emails, you can go and send postcards in the mail. It basically is like a campaign, right? You basically are campaigning. But nobody told me that. Nobody told me what exactly I could do or the fact that I could do these things. I thought it was just something where we just kind of talk amongst each other at the convention. But I didn't know that you could actually do campaigning in the lead up to the convention. So now I know. And if I go back to the next convention next year, which we'll see if I decide to do it, we'll see. I'm still debating about it. But the point is that if I do it again, I'll definitely know a lot more on what to do this time. But with that being said, so the state parties, they choose in terms of the way it operates in Texas on the Democrat side. So I really can't speak on the Republican side because I haven't been involved in their process. But on the Democrat side, the way it works is, you can try to run for it at the state convention, and then from there they select the electors. And it is true that the number of electors is going to coincide with the congressional delegation, House members plus senators, right? So because Texas is the second most populated, and of course let's go back to what we talked about in chapter 2, right? That Texas has so many House members because they're the second most populated state. The House delegation is dependent on population, and then all the states get 2 senators regardless of population. So this is why Texas has the second highest congressional delegation in the entire country, second only to California, because Texas is the second highest populated state, and so that's why there's going to be a lot of electors, at the state level. So the Democrat Party at the state convention will choose their electors, and then the Republican Party at their state convention will choose their electors, right? I'm assuming they do it the same way. They might do it a little bit differently, but I'm assuming they do it the same way. So the point is that both of the state parties in Texas have their own set of electors, right? So whichever presidential candidate wins the electoral votes, and basically they have to get a majority, they have to get more votes than the other candidate, then all those electors go to that presidential candidate, right? So let's kind of reiterate this. So there are 538 electors in all. The winning candidate needs a majority. They need 270 to become president. And of course, let's talk a little about the one attempt to reform is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which I was talking about earlier in terms of what the states are trying to do to make it mandatory for the electors to vote according to the state voting totals, right? So each state's electoral college votes would go to the candidate that won the popular vote, right? So you wouldn't have a situation where the electors would change their votes. They just have to go with whichever candidate wins the popular vote. So let me show you all the electoral map here really quickly. Let's see. So let me show it to you all really quickly. Let's go to, this is the electoral map from 2020, right? So Joe Biden wins the presidency. He defeats the former incumbent Donald Trump. Joe Biden wins the electoral college. He gets 306 electoral votes compared to Trump's 232, which is interesting because this is actually the same number of what I'm trying to say is that Trump won in 2016 with 306 and Hillary got 232. So it's flipped, right? So it's the same number of electoral votes that won it for Joe Biden that had won it for Trump 4 years ago, right? So that's kind of interesting. But let's take a look at the breakdown here. Okay. Now, also do remember, everyone, this also goes back to what we talked about when we were talking about the political parties, how that Democrats tend to do well up here in the Northeast, as well as the Rust Belt, the Midwest, and the West Coast, as well as some of the southern Rocky Mountain states. Republicans tend to do well in the Deep South, moving up here towards some of the Midwest, and then the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain states over here. Now, let's take a look. So most of these states are not that confusing, right? Because a lot of these states are very solidly either Republican or Democrat. But there were a few changes, right? Now, let me also mention it here that for most of these states, the way the electoral votes work is, so let's go to Texas really quickly. So Trump wins Texas by about 6,600 votes, right? Pretty much. Now, it was considered a battleground state, but and you can see that this is kind of, a lot of people have different opinions about Texas. Is Texas a battleground state? Is it not? There's still a lot of back and forth about that. But the point is that it's not like Trump wins overwhelmingly, like compared to Oklahoma. You see how in Oklahoma, Trump wins by like 2/3 of the vote, right? Some of these other states where he does, really well, so Arkansas as well. So some of these really, like Idaho also, so the Republicans are solidly red over there. And then in New York, the Democrats are also solidly over there, right? California as well, California 2/3. Hawaii is also another one. Yeah, I see 2/3. And Washington a little bit closer because you got some conservative areas over here, like in Spokane, but still pretty blue. Now, again, going back to the way the Electoral College works is that depending on the way it works is that it's a winner-take-all system where the presidential candidate why is it still at 99%? What, they're still counting votes like a couple of years ago? Maybe they just haven't. Oh, they haven't updated yet. I guess they didn't. They stopped updating it. But the point is that the candidate that gets the most votes in a state gets all the electoral votes. It's not proportional. So it's not like Trump gets 52% of the electoral votes in Texas. It's a winner-take-all system where if you don't win the state, you don't get anything, except for in Nebraska and in Maine. Here they do allow for some proportional representation based on the districts, right? So, so over here in this, when it comes to electoral votes here, we see that Biden got one of them because he was able to win one of the districts here, and then Trump also got one. So it's kind of like they exchanged, right? So Trump also got an electoral vote in Maine because he was able to win one of the districts out there, right? So those are the two states where they do assign electoral votes proportionally, right? So and the states do have the ability to do so. Okay, so that's the way it works, right? So that's where you get the votes. Now let's take a look at why Joe Biden was able to win. In 2016, Trump was able to win these three states were the main states that gave Trump the election: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Trump was able to win these states in the Rust Belt. He was basically able to sweep the Rust Belt states. However, in 2020, Joe Biden won these states back. That's why there's the cross-hatching lines, right? This was a flip, right? So Joe Biden was able to, and you can see, look how close he won Pennsylvania, right? He wins it by just barely over 1%. Also, very close in Michigan by about 150,000 votes. Wisconsin is also really close. Look at that. Wisconsin, that's the closest one. Look, Biden won it by 20,000 votes. Very, very close. We'll also take a look at Arizona. He also won Arizona. And we'll get to Arizona and Georgia right now here in a bit because these were also very close. But the point is that these are the states that won the presidency for Joe Biden because he was able to flip these states because these three states were Republican in 2016. Joe Biden was also able to flip two former red states that have been red for a while, particularly Georgia. So Joe Biden wins Georgia by about 12,000 votes, very close. And then over here in Arizona, also by about the same margin, wins it by about 11,000 votes. So these two states had been red, but now they've gone blue. So these are definitely true battleground states. So you see why the Electoral College is very stressful, and it's something that causes a lot of stress because you have to win these states, because if you come in second place, you don't win anything. Now, there has been talk about, should we have more proportional representation? So, so if we had a proportional representation, maybe like for the 16 electoral votes, you would have maybe you could have like a virtual tie, or maybe like 9 and 7 or something like that if it was more proportional, and things like that. But that's the way that the system is so far. So does this make sense really quickly, everyone, in terms of how the Electoral College works? I just want to make sure that this makes sense in terms of why there's a lot of discussion in it and why it gets a lot of attention. Does this make sense or not really in terms of the way the program? Okay, so it does make sense. Okay, so this is why when you all see the maps, you're going to see why there's so much attention to it and why the media definitely, we should have what Maine and Nebraska does. So Ella, so you're more in favor of like the more proportional representation. So you're saying that we should allow for, it shouldn't be winner take all, right? And I definitely do get that point, because let's go back to the map really quickly, because let's kind of talk about this a little bit more, because one of the criticisms of the Electoral College is that, let's say if you live in California and you're a Republican, it's going to be very hard to get motivated to turn out for this election, because it's pretty clear that the Republican candidate is not going to win California. So if you're a Republican in California, it might be hard to get enthusiastic about, well, why should I bother if we know that, the Democrat candidate is going to win? Or on the opposite, if you're a Democrat like in Oklahoma, are you going to be all that motivated to turn out if we know that the Republican candidate is going to win these states? Let me check the trend. The Electoral College is outdated and was put in place by the elites because they didn't trust the common citizen to be able to properly elect president. Yes, Ella, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. That definitely was a safeguard that was put in place by the founders. And we've talked about how, again, I do get where they're coming from. I do understand their sentiment. I do understand that because the nation was in its infancy. Let me kind of stop the show real quick. So let's talk about this a little bit. Right. So I do understand where they're coming from. Right. I understand that, the country is in its infancy. I understand that they're not trusting the average person. But you do bring up a good point, right? That in the last 250 years, we have seen, and we also talked about this in the voting chapter, right? We talked about how that people the requirements for voting were a lot more stringent. You had to be a white male property owner, basically. So throughout the last 250 years, we have expanded voting access, right? We've allowed for more people to get involved in the electoral process, to be able to vote. We've also allowed more people to get involved in the primary system, right? Instead of the party elites basically picking the president, now the people do. So yes, it would make sense to basically look, to keep looking at the electoral college and basically be like, well, do we really need to put these safeguards in place? Should we have more of a direct type of election, or should we still have something where they still have to pick up some votes regionally? Because there are pros and cons to this, and we'll talk about the pros and cons here in a bit. So Elda says people are more knowledgeable, and political parties have resorted to sensationalizing and play the media to keep good. Yeah, right, exactly. There is a lot of sensationalization when it comes to the primary process, right? And we also talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the political parties, right? That these primaries can get really ugly, right? Go and look at the 2016 Republican primaries. See how Trump and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush were kind of going at it, I'd never seen anything like it. I was actually watching it live, and I'd never seen anything like it. It was just insane how everyone was just kind of ripping everyone. It wasn't just Trump, although you could probably say that Trump was the instigator, but everyone else was kind of firing back, and it just kind of, I don't know, it kind of drug everyone through the mud, so to speak. You know what I mean? It was definitely something that, even Reince Priebus, the RNC chairman, had to make a statement like at the next debate and all that stuff. It was definitely something that, not a lot of people were too thrilled about that. But right, what you're saying is that there is that sensationalizing, and the media does play a part in it as well, right? Because you also have to remember that the media wants to get viewers, right? They're, especially for the for-profit media, they're wanting to get that advertising, so they need to try to sensationalize it, right? They're treating it like a sporting event, right? Like, even if you look at that CNN video, the way the music is, the intro, it feels like you're gonna watch like a football game. It's like, like who's going to win the Iowa caucus? Stay tuned in, to see the results. Like kind of like you're going to watch a sporting event, right? So that is not a coincidence, right? Because they want to sensationalize it, like you're saying, and treat it like. Now, at the same time, though, I do like that it gets attention, but is it the right type of attention? I think that's kind of where we're kind of talking about here, right? Is it, does it become a situation where it becomes more like a contest, whereas it shouldn't necessarily be about the contest? It should be about, what are these candidates going to do for us, right? Where do they stand on the issues, instead of just trying to one up each other and trying to win like a popularity contest, right? So yeah, I definitely get that sentiment as well. But let's talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons to this, right? So one of the pros for thank you, yes, and it shouldn't be that way, right? Because it should be more about the issues. It should be more about what these candidates are going to do for the people, instead of just, which again, unfortunately with a lot of elections, it does tend to be a popularity contest. I've gone to plenty of local town hall debates and events, if they have them, and the people that are usually just there are usually like the family members and the friends, and they're just cheering them on like as if it's some sort of like sporting event, like as if I'm like at a high school football game with the parents cheering. So, which again, it should be like, it should be more about the issues, right? But if the people aren't really, and I don't blame the people. I've said before that I think that it's also the role of the candidates. Like, the candidates also need to bear some of the responsibility, to where, like, if, let's say, you're going to go vote for someone and you don't really know anything about them, but you've researched and you can't find anything, well, that's on the candidate. Like, that's the candidate's fault for not putting out more information. So now it shouldn't just be it shouldn't just be the individual, right? The candidates also need to bear some of the blame for not doing a good job of getting that information out to the public. So anyway, that's kind of how I see it too. But anyway, let's kind of go back really quickly before we end for today. So there's pros and cons to electoral college, to where one of the pros to it is that it creates a situation where candidates have to try to go to different parts of the country, because for the people who support the electoral college, they make the argument that if it was just based on the popular vote, that we would just have candidates going to the cities, right? New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and they would just try to run up the score there and not have to go to the rural areas. So I do get that sentiment. I do understand that sentiment. And that definitely is a good point. But on the flip side, again, it also creates a situation where unless you live in one of these battleground states, then you might feel like your vote is not really going to count. So that's why I think a lot of people are kind of agreeing with maybe still keeping it, but maybe having it more towards like proportional representation, like you all mentioned, like with Nebraska and Maine. So maybe, right, instead of having it winner take all, and that's kind of how I see it too. Instead of having it winner take all, why not just have it proportional, right? Where, like in California, the Democrat candidate would pick up like 2/3 of the electoral votes, and the Republican would get a third. So you would still need to go to different parts of the country to try to pick up votes, but it wouldn't be a situation where people would feel that their vote doesn't count if they're of a party that's in the minority in a state, right? So I don't know. That's if you were asking me, that's how I would do it. I'd probably want to still keep, the semblance of the electoral college, but at the same time, also have it more proportionally represented. Okay, so let's see. I think that would satisfy the popular vote too, so that people don't feel robbed like with it. Yes, right. Because that also is a very good point, right? That because of the way the electoral college is set up, you could have a situation where the candidate that wins the popular vote does not win the presidency, like we saw with Al Gore in 2000. We saw with Donald Trump in 2016. We also have to note that originally that had only happened, I think it was once, right? Like with Rutherford B. Hayes in one of the elections of the 1870s, but it's happened twice in the last 20 years. So that's why people are saying like, well, is there a trend now? It's happened now twice recently. So, and right. And so obviously, of course, in this last election, Joe Biden won by 7 million votes. He won by the popular vote by a lot. So that wasn't really an issue there. But yes, it does become a situation where the electoral college can create a situation where, especially like with the Florida fiasco, where the candidate that doesn't win the popular vote can still win the presidency. So anyway, so yeah, no, this is definitely a very, very good discussion. It may already happen. The 2020 vote election in Pennsylvania took long hours to release the votes to allow. Yes, and that is also another point that we also have to mention is that because elections are handled at the state and local levels, every state's going to be different with how the vote numbers are released. And you'll see this like if some of y'all were watching the election day coverage, they talked about this, right? They talked about how some states, like I think Pennsylvania's like this, where they don't release the early voting numbers until after the polls close on election day or something like that, right? They don't release the early voting numbers. They wait a little bit longer than some of the other states is what I'm trying to say. So every state's different in terms of how they run the elections. So because, again, elections are handled at the state and local level, there's different ways they report the information. There's different ways that they gather the information. And, of course, there's different ballots, right? So it's definitely a big nightmare when it comes to, like we saw in Florida, right? We talked about that last time. So, but yes, Andrew, you are exactly right. So, but yes. So we can definitely talk a lot about the electoral college. It's definitely something that gets a lot of attention here. So, okay. So I know we're already running out of time. And I know I said I wanted to finish the rest of the chapter by today, but we're not going to be able to. So what we'll do is we'll finish the chapter next time. That's good because, or let me go and stop the share really quickly. So that way we'll talk about this here.